Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Settle down. May I have your attention, please? I'm Crosby Kemper, the director of the Kansas City Public Library, one-time teacher in Chengdu, Sichuan. And we're delighted to have you here. We're very grateful to the Edgar Snow Symposium at UMKC and to the Kansas City Chinese American Association for being sponsors of tonight's wonderful event. And we're glad that you're all here, packed in. You probably know what it's like now to walk on the sidewalks of Shanghai. It's my job tonight to introduce my great good friend, longtime good friend, Bob Holden, which I'll do in a second. I do want to mention a couple of things that are happening at the library. Most importantly, I want to tell you that we are once again doing a big read, the NEA's Big Read, where we get everyone in the community to read one book. This year, we're doing True Grit by Charles Portis, which is a famous novel about a Chinese cowboy after the Civil War. That's a joke, by the way. He's not a Chinese cowboy. In fact, I know, are there any? No. But some of you might know it from the John Wayne movie. Some of you might know it from the Jeff Bridges movie. We're establishing book groups all over town. We hope you will join one or form one. And if you pick up one of these, I think they're left on your seats, you'll find out about how to participate in this, and we urge you to do it. Reading is very important in our community, and we need to do more of it. I also want to mention that tomorrow night we have Jeffrey Frank with his very good book. It's been, I think, scrolling up here, Ike and Dick. And so those of you who are interested in Nixon going to China will learn more about that from Ike and Dick, the background of that anyway, in Nixon's relationship with Eisenhower and what went on in the 50s. But tonight I get the opportunity to welcome Bob Holden back to the Kansas City Public Library. Bob and I have been friends since he first ran for state treasurer when we were both very young men in the 19th century. Bob and I, though we do come from opposite political parties, have been good friends and share a lot. The two things that we share most closely, an interest in Shakespeare, I would say, and education, which led Bob to appoint me chair of a commission on the future of higher education in Missouri, and an interest in China. And Bob, as most of you know, here was state treasurer of Missouri. He was governor of Missouri from 2001 to 2005. He's a professor, I think, still at Webster University. He's also head of the, I'm going to see if I get this right, the Midwest U.S.-China Association, and has been probably Missouri's leading promoter of good relations between the People's Republic of China and the United States, and particularly Missouri and Kansas City and St. Louis. So it's a great honor for us to have Bob back here. The last time he was here, we unveiled his portrait, and the First Lady, the former First Lady of the state of Missouri, Lori Hauser Holden, who is also here with Bob, we unveiled their official portraits. She was a lot better looking than he was, but I still love Bob Holden. So Bob, welcome.
Most of what Crosby said is true, but not all of it. No, Crosby and I do go back a long ways, even though we come from different political parties. I always have known Crosby to be one that you don't have to guess where he's coming from or what he's thinking or what he wants to do. And we need that in education and as well as many other things. Well, before I get into my comments for tonight, to all you Royals fans, congratulations for another victory today. Your Chiefs did very well on Sunday. Keep it up. I'm very delighted to be back because we're talking about a subject that is very important to me as an individual, as a Missourian, as a Midwesterner, and someone who believes that this country and China can find many opportunities to work together for the success of both. Crosby always goes out of his way to try to find interesting programs, and he's done it again tonight. But as a former governor and now the chairman of the Midwest U.S.-China Association, I want to applaud Kansas City. And Scott Wagner's in the back of the room, and Scott's been truly one of your leaders in doing that. Scott, thank you very much. I applaud Kansas City's efforts to become truly an international city. Last summer, we hosted a Chinese delegation from the International Department Central Committee of CPC, and they were very impressed with the progressive leadership and the dynamic business leaders who support endeavors such as the ones here tonight. Before we hear from our guest speaker this evening, I want to talk to you briefly about what we're doing with the Midwest U.S.-China Association and talking about trying to develop truly a regional approach with China. Since I assumed the chairmanship, I've been working to make the Midwest region of the 12 Midwestern states work more collectively in a bipartisan way so that we can build the relationships with China that helps all of us going forward. The truth is that the Midwest as a region has tremendous assets. We're home to 143 Fortune 500 companies, 1/5 of the world's fresh water, the largest supply in the world, and are located right here in the Midwest, along with the interstate highway system, the rails, the roads, the waters, the air, all of those. We've got 1,300 major colleges and universities, 3 of the top 10 national science laboratories, all in the Midwest United States. But what most people don't realize is if you take the 12 Midwestern states as a region, we have the 5th largest economy in the world. The 5th largest economy in the world. We want China to see the Midwest as a region that is open for business and a willing partner. And on the flip side of the coin, we also want Midwesterners to understand that in this global economy, China is a partner, not only a competitor, but they can be a partner, and that's what we're striving for. One way we are promoting the Midwest is through building relationships with the private sector in China. I just returned from Toledo last week, where the Shenzhen High-Tech Fair was visiting that community, signed an MOU that in 2014, they plan on bringing the Shenzhen High-Tech Fair to Toledo, Ohio. Now, that may not sound like much, but in Shenzhen, at this fair in 2013, they had 500,000 participants. They had 2,900 exhibitors, and they had over 2,500 potential investors in the products and in the technology that was being discussed. Another example of how the Midwest U.S.-China Association is building relationships is on the education front. As Scott knows, and several others, CJ and Wendy and others, Nancy, if they're in the room, Jan, this last year, the American Legion Missouri Boys State Program and Girls State Program brought 36 students from China to participate in that program at Warrensburg, Missouri. The first time anything like that has ever been done in the 78-year history of the American Legion program, and it was done here in Missouri. And our goal is to start doing that throughout the entire Midwest and across the United States. If you build relationships with young people, the rest of your economy will follow. As the parents of 2 children, I know what soccer's all about because our son played soccer. I know what baseball's all about because he played baseball. I know what history's all about because they're focused on history and those issues. We follow our children. And if we develop a relationship with our young people and our 2 cultures, all of us will be benefited by it. Governmentally, we are working closely with the Midwest Governors Association to create a combined effort to further government and commercial ties between the Midwest and China. The Midwest Governors Association Chairman, Governor Dayton, is actively considering leading an initiative on behalf of the Midwest governors to partner with the Midwest U.S.-China Association to expand our efforts in building those relationships with China. As I say on frequent occasions, it is all about relationships. The more we integrate our cultures, our priorities, and our economies, the more prosperous everyone can be. Relationships are the foundation for partnerships. Has anybody ever heard of a place called Muscatine, Iowa? A few people have now. About a year and a half ago, if you'll remember, the future president of China, President Xi, was coming to the United States for his first visit in 27 years. He went to New York, the financial capital of the world. He went to Washington, D.C., the political capital of our country. He went to Los Angeles because of the technology and what it brings, the opportunities to China. And he went to a place called Muscatine, Iowa, to see his friends that he had met 27 years ago when he was a lowly public official on an ag mission. Relationships make a difference, and they do matter. And that's one of the reasons I'm so pleased to have Jeffrey Wasserstrom with us this evening, because he truly is an expert and knowledgeable. He's got a background in Indiana as well as many other places, but he's someone that we can listen to with a great deal of knowledge that he knows what he's talking about. He's a Chancellor Professor of Chinese History at the University of California, Irvine. He's a specialist in Chinese history, ranging from revolutions to patterns of student protest, and from the way that globalization affects urban life and popular culture to American images of Asia. And let me tell you that their image of us and our image of them needs to be improved. We both need to really understand the other. He is the author of books such as China in the 21st Century, which everyone needs to know, and is co-editor of the Chinese Character, Profiles of Fast-Changing Lives in a Fast-Changing Land. He is a fellow of the Asian Society, editor of the Journal of Asian Studies, and co-editor of the Asian section of the Los Angeles Review of Books. He was a co-founder of the China Beat Log, and he is a contributor to the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Time, Slate, and many others. Prior to his current position at UC Irvine, he spent 15 years at Indiana University in Bloomington, where in addition to teaching, he spent a year as the acting editor of the Bloomington-based American Historical Review. Dr. Wasserstrom received his bachelor's degree from UC Santa Cruz, his master's degree at Harvard University, and his doctorate at UC Berkeley. He tweets regularly, at J. Wasser. So before we begin, get out your smartphones, open Twitter, and make sure you follow him to stay plugged in to what the issues and discussion we'll have tonight. Thank you very much, Dr. Wasserstrom.
That was a wonderful introduction. Thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here. I love speaking at libraries. I'm married to a librarian, so I always have one thing I can say that connects to the venue when I speak at a library. But I like to localize whatever kind of talk. I'll say some things I say other places, but I always want to say something that connects to this moment in time. And I have a couple things I'm going to say about that in a minute, but I didn't realize until hearing about upcoming programs here that I do have a tie to True Grit. To come out here, I flew from the John Wayne Airport, which is Santa Ana. Enough said. There's a giant statue of the Duke there, by the way. But the connection I thought of to localize this is the fact that obviously, you know from one of the sponsoring agencies of this that one of the most important American writers on China of all time was Edgar Snow, who is a local. And just a sign of his importance, I pulled off covers of his book in different languages, his most famous book in different languages. But he is not the only famous Missourian to have written important books about China. And in fact, I can show you 3 other covers, all by people with ties to Missouri, all from here. Agnes Smedley, who along the same time as Edgar Snow was writing quite radical works, fairly sympathetic to the Chinese Revolution. Carl Crow, who wrote this at the time, big bestseller, 400 million customers. And I have a personal note about Carl Crow. I was exchanging an email with his biographer, Paul French, and mentioning that I was speaking in Missouri and was going to mention this. And Paul, who's British, said he tried to get Carl Crow nominated for a place in the Missouri Journalism Hall of Fame or Association, and he said they couldn't do it because he wasn't an American doing the nominating. So he asked me to please ask one of you to nominate Carl Crow after this for this. The other famous person with ties to Missouri from that same very important golden age, what I think of as the first golden age of American writing on China, which is the 1930s and 1940s. I think we're now, and this is talking about journalism and deeply informed journalism, I think we're now in a second golden age of writing about China. I spend a lot of time saying that I try to get beyond what you get about China from the media, but what I really mean is getting beyond what you get from a kind of soundbite, short attention span version of the media. We now have the best core of deeply informed, committed journalists writing about China that we've had since that heyday of the 30s and 40s. The third person, Emily Hahn, who was born in St. Louis, and then went on to become the New Yorker's main writer about China in the 1930s and 40s. Very colorful figure, lived on for decades, writing about many different places. So these were all the famous people writing about China with ties to Missouri at that time. But you flash forward to the present, and there's also somebody very important. Now, I think the single most important writer of English language popular books about China, Peter Hessler, who was the New Yorker's China correspondent for much of the last decade and a half or so, has written this trilogy of China books. They're very important. Noticing the tie from the era of Edgar Snow, Agnes Smedley, and Emily Hahn up to Peter Hessler, who grew up in Columbia, Missouri. I wrote a piece called "To Understand China, Do You Have to Be from Missouri?" And I sent it to the Columbia School of Journalism's Global Journalist magazine, and they retitled it From the Middle West to the Middle Kingdom, which maybe they thought they would be too bragging to just focus on Missouri. But I think it's quite extraordinary. And I haven't mentioned the single most famous writer from Missouri who wrote about China, except he didn't go there, but he was obsessed with it for much of his life, which is Mark Twain. Mark Twain almost went to China. This is one of the great, what-ifs of history. He was in Hawaii and met Anson Burlingame, who had gone to China and was involved with connecting China to America. And Burlingame, they became friends, and Burlingame said, I want you to go to China as the sort of American minister of culture. And Twain was thinking about it, but he didn't make it. And in fact, he traveled around the world. He wrote wonderful travel writings. And China was one place he never went, but he wrote about it quite often during his life. He set one of his early stories was set with a Chinese person leaving Shanghai to come to American experiences. He wrote very movingly about discrimination against Chinese in America, as well as criticizing other forms of discrimination. And the book that I'm working on right now is on the Boxer Uprising of 1900 and differing ways of that moment. And Mark Twain wrote about that at a time when Americans were very horrified at the fact there were Boxers rising up attacking Christianity. Mark Twain said, if I were Chinese, I'd be a Boxer. They're trying to get the missionaries out of there. He was no fan of missionaries. So there you have this whole kind of Missouri theme, which is you can all feel very good about yourselves to connecting to China, except I realized after I wrote that piece about do you have to be from Missouri to understand China, that a lot of my favorite journalists now are from Minnesota. So now I think it's something about an M state. And so just, I could show you, they haven't all written books yet. They're just, but they're the people you hear if you listen to public radio. Rob Schmitz of Marketplace is doing great reporting. He's from Minnesota. Mary Kay Magistad, who reports for The World from China, also from Minnesota. And a book to watch for in the fall, Junkyard Planet, is about the global trash industry, and it's by Adam Minter, who's been writing about China from Shanghai for The Atlantic and other venues. And he's the son of a scrapyard owner from Minneapolis. And talking about it's a really fun book, a mixture of memoir, reportage, and analysis of an important economic thing we don't think about, which is scrap metal circulating the world and other forms of trash. So that's the local themed part of this evening. And now I'm going to focus on plugging the book. This is the first edition of China in the 21st Century, What Everyone Needs to Know. And I want you to know that very kind of, well, pompous-sounding subtitle was not my definition. Oxford University Press has a series called the What Everyone Needs to Know series. And they started it they backed into it. Because what they were doing initially was somebody came to them, a specialist on Islam, who, after 9/11, was getting a lot of questions that revealed to him the limits of American understanding of Islam. And he kept, at the end of his talks, he would say, well, here's something I always get asked about Islam, and here's what the reality is. And then he collected them together into this kind of debunking myths and stereotypes. And he sent it to Oxford, and they published it as What Everyone Needs to Know About Islam, and it sold really well because there is a pressing need, and there is still now. There was particularly after 9/11, and it's not gotten any less to need to understand this. So what Oxford thought was, well, what other things that cause a kind of, not necessarily anxiety and fear, but there's a sense of urgency about understanding this. And I was in dialogue with editors at Oxford. I work with them, and I said, I'd really like to do a short book on China. And they had another series, the very short introduction series, and somebody had already done the Modern China book very well. I said, darn, he got to that first. He said, we've got this new series, What Everyone Needs to Know. It's question and answers. And what we'd really like you to do is one on the Chinese economy, because that makes Americans very nervous. I said, I want to do a short book, but if I do the Chinese economy, it will be a really short book, because economics is not really my forte. And so I said, well, could I just be about China? They said, that's too big. So we had the Goldilocks problem, something big enough, but not too big for me to take on. And they thought, what about the 21st century? And I said, that would be great. And then I used it as an excuse to slip in a whole bunch of history. Because to understand the present, you have to understand the past, not just with China, but with other things. So the first question in the book is, who was Confucius? Just a basic discussion of Confucius. And then I start going into, has Confucius always been revered in China? Which, there are now these Confucius institutes set up around the world. And at the opening ceremonies, the Olympics began with sort of honoring, quoting Confucius and things. And I say, well, actually, no. Confucius has sometimes been very much in favor, sometimes out of favor. As recently as a few decades ago, the Chinese Communist Party, which is now in power and starting those Confucius institutes, was reviling Confucius as a feudal, backward thinker who had kept China back. So to understand even that simple thing about the present, you have to understand the distant past, what Confucius said and what he thought, and the recent past, his rise and fall in popularity. When the Olympics were going on, I thought it was really interesting that in the commentaries on the opening ceremonies, nobody was mentioning this. That just a few decades ago, Confucius was a has-been, reviled figure. And I thought this was odd because what do sports commentators love? They love the story of the comeback kid. Person who had an injury, was headed to greatness, injured, and then still wins the race. If there was a great comeback kid of the Olympics, it was Confucius. Anyway, so China keeps changing. It keeps being important. So people buy the book, and I get to update the book, or I have to update the book, because China changes so fast that the first edition came out in 2010. And often you'll go 5, 10 years, 20 years before you really need an update. But with China, the speed of change, and this is something I think thinking about China, people have lived through experiences that make the kind of life experience differences from somebody who's in their 30s and a teenager is like what the life experiences somebody like me when I was a teenager and my grandparent or great-grandparent in terms of the coming in of new technologies and things like that. So there's a speed of change. One thing I like to use to illustrate that is in China when I first was there in the mid-1980s, nobody had a family telephone. If you wanted to make a phone call, I grew up with a landline in my family's house, and you made a phone call, and your parents might hear you. In China, to make a phone call at that point, you could use a neighborhood phone, and any of your neighbors could hear you. That was 1986. Now, nobody still has a landline in their family. They've jumped straight to the era of cell phones. Nobody really had a private car when I was there in the 1980s, and now, if you're doing well, you have private cars. So these kinds of shifts that took place over a long period of time in many parts of the West are happening at rapid speed. And the political structure or the speed of events are going very quickly. So when I wrote the book, when the book came out in 2010, I put it to sleep in 2009, finished correcting the proofs. There was no mention of the artist Ai Weiwei. He didn't seem that important. He was doing stuff, but he hadn't made headlines in the same way that he would later. Liu Xiaobo hadn't won the Nobel Prize. So I was looking in the Xi Jinping didn't get an entry in the index. So I figured I needed to redo it so that they would have places in the index. And also some things that seemed enormously important then seemed less important a little bit later. So there were things that needed to be adjusted, even if I could leave the part about Confucius and some of the other dynasties things all as they were. So I brought in a collaborator to help me update it, Mara Elizabeth Cunningham, who had been editor of the China Beat blog and is a graduate student at Irvine and is making her name for herself as an independent writer on China as well. So she came in to help me update it and have another voice. And we came up with one where we didn't have to change the cover. And I loved the cover, so I was really glad. And I was glad because it still seemed relevant, the things I had thought about the cover and been thinking about at the time. So the cover, you don't judge a book by its cover, but this one you can. It's OK. What the cover says to me, the simplest thing it says, is when I went to China, you saw scenes like this, which is everybody in the ruling party basically on the same page, voting in unison, clapping in unison. But you did not see scenes like this, which is taken outside of a punk rock concert. And in fact, there was only one rock concert in China the year I was there, in Shanghai. It was Jan and Dean, an old surf rock group. And they came over, and this is a little known fact, but the Jan and Dean concert helped start a wave of protests that it wasn't the only thing, but it was one of many things that actually led to the Tiananmen protests of 1989, in which rock and roll was quite important. During the Jan and Dean concert, which local authorities made a lot about, where, see, we're connecting to the world, we're bringing international music here, youth music. At the concert, security guards kept the students from getting up to dance or even standing up during the concert. And some of the students who were angry about democracy and wanting freedom of speech and other things thought, boy, this really sums up the problem with our country right now. You bring a rock group here to show we're connected, and you don't let us dance. And this kind of thing, which I think is really important when we think about the protests of Tiananmen a few years later in '89, students went to the square demanding democracy in a formal sense, complaining about corruption, but also crying out to be part of global youth culture and crying out for more individual freedom in how they expressed themselves and how they spent their leisure time and what they did for fun. After '89, the government made a kind of new deal with the protesters after the crackdown. They realized they wanted to do something to prevent something like that again. They said, we'll start giving you more and more choices in your private life. We'll stop trying to micromanage what you listen to in your dorm room, who you're friends with, and we'll let you dance at the concerts if we bring it there. They didn't say that, but that was the implication. And we'll give you more choices of what kind of clothes you wear and what kind of stuff you buy if you allow us to keep not letting you have a choice on who governs you. And the other part of this deal was, and we will continue economic reforms, and your material life, your daily life will get better and better if the deal is that you let the political structure go. And so this is a kind of scene at the time I didn't think you would see if you kept seeing this. Flash forward to 2010 or 2013, and you still have the political scene looking like this, but now you have the kind of largely anything goes kind of private life thing that would symbolize. And this is the great conundrum for any China specialist to sort out about China, or anybody who tries to understand global political systems. Because in the Soviet bloc, you just did not have a structure in which the politics continued, but the kind of daily life, cultural life changed as much as it did, opened as much as it did in China. So I like to have a little bit of audience participation at this point. I've talked about what's different about this set, this picture, and this picture. But can anybody tell me something that's similar about this picture and this picture? There are no wrong answers here. There'll be wrong answers to the second question I asked. What do you see there? Yeah?
Mao Zedong, he started the communism.
Mao Zedong, yes, excellent. And Che. So there is a connection of kind of rebellion, some connection to communism there. Great. I heard also they're all men. Very, very important. You'll hear a lot about, Mao did absolutely horrible things during his lifetime, make no bones about it. And Edgar Snow let him off, even though it's the Edgar Snow Foundation that's sponsored. Edgar Snow let him off much too easily, because he was taken in by the charisma. And he didn't have access to other kinds of information necessarily. But one thing that Mao did that was good, that there's been a negative retreat post-Mao, is that Mao is the male communist leader who wrote most about the oppression of women of any of sort of great global male leader of revolutions. One of the first things that the Communist Party introduced in 1950 was a new marriage law that gave women equal rights in divorce and marriage. And it wasn't perfect under Mao, but there was an effort to get male-female equality. Didn't go far enough, but since during the reforms, there's been a retreat from that. And in fact, in many ways, there are all sorts of ways in which Chinese women are disadvantaged in the kind of move toward a particular kind of capitalism that's going on in China that doesn't have some of the checks built in against things like sexual discrimination in the workplace. In China, in some ways, the form of capitalism is like what was in the US in less enlightened times. For example, in China, unlike the United States, you can advertise for women to work in particular jobs and specify what their height and weight or measurements might be. And you had that during ways of a kind of crudeness of sexism that went away in the United States with certain kinds of reforms, and that was largely abolished for a time there.
Why are they all holding their hand in this position like they're about to receive?
They're clapping. They're clapping. They're all saying what a good thing has just been said. Yeah, they look like they're supplicants there. You do that. Anything else that's similar, tops and bottom? Yeah.
You mentioned about sexism.
Yeah.
I was watching on YouTube some of the Chinese National Day parades with their armed forces. They emphasize the role of their women in the armed forces. It looks very fun. Do they have the kind of massive rape problems in their armed forces of their women soldiers that the United States has?
Wow. That's a tough question. But I do think, the importance of women within the armed forces is a carryover for something that was done early and that hasn't been retreated from. The problem with questions like that is if they did, we would not know about it as much. So we do this. Yeah. Yeah. Similarities between top and bottom so that I'm going to move on in a minute, but top and bottom similarities, any more? The color red shows up a lot. I always like to mention that because that's something to do with communism. Communism is colored red. It was the biggest break that the Chinese Communist Party got in symbolic terms, that the global color of communism was red. Because in China, red was the color of wealth, fecundity, prosperity, good times. So in fact, you actually at New Year's things, you have couplets up wishing good fortune that are in red. And so even though this is a Communist Party event, this looks a lot like a kind of carryover to kind of folk resonances. Chiang Kai-shek, there were lots of reasons why he lost out to the Communist Party, but color didn't help him. Because the color of anti-communism was white globally, the white forces, red forces, and white in China is a color of mourning. But the thing that I think is really interesting that I didn't notice at first until I was told this, you're getting there. I was told this by somebody who grew up in China who said that I hadn't mentioned the most interesting similarity, which is they all dyed their hair. Okay, so in order to keep, and this is interesting to think about. You know, China is saying it's a Confucian country. Confucian countries, you venerate the elderly. So why do these men always want to seem younger, except for the one rebel there? But it's partly because the Communist Party's been saying for a long time, we're handing off power to younger and younger people. But they're handing it off from 70-year-olds to 68-year-olds to then 65-year-olds. So the jet black hair. So I couldn't have used this picture if Xi Jinping had just gone gray. But there was one photo that showed little flecks of gray in it, which was pointed out by another of my favorite writers on China, the new New Yorker correspondent on China, Evan Osnos, so the most recent one. And I told him, boy, you're really, you really saw that. You noticed those flecks of gray. So actually, my wife did. And so I said, OK, I'll have to start reading your wife on China. But here you go. Here's the picture of the new standing committee of the Chinese Communist Party being introduced, the new leaders. And I thought, you know, OK, they aren't on the picture in the old cover, but I can still use the cover, because look at them. And it looks like, and I was thinking about it like, OK, so this is a sign of continuity with the past. I used the bottom picture to say this is what's kind of not changing about China, whereas the top picture is what is changing. And then I thought about it, but actually, if you go back a little further, or even to even partly to the mid-'80s, this does represent a change of sorts in the way Chinese male leaders have looked. There was a period when Chinese male leaders under Mao did not dress like male leaders in other parts of the world. And this is an interesting thing, because one of the things that has also been going on about China is China, even though it's remained, people say it's the, one of the lone holdouts of a Communist Party political system, but in some of the forms, there's been a shift toward seeming at least more like other countries, less standing apart. We talk about President Xi Jinping, and before that, President Hu Jintao, President Jiang Zemin, but before that, remember, it was Chairman Mao and Vice Chairman Dunc Xiaoping. He had a very complicated name that kind of hid what he was doing. So I was thinking about that with forms and other things. And the way in which powerful men dress has been used as a symbol of the more globalized the structure is, the more mutually identifiable in similar terms powerful men are. This is one of the shifts. A wonderful book on globalization, The Birth of the Modern World, talks about how in 1750, if you went around the world, the powerful men around the world dressed nothing alike. They were from very fancy regalia in some parts of the world to ritualized undress in the South Sea Islands. And yet, by around 1900, powerful men around the world would recognize each other in part by kind of frock coats and top hats. So I thought about that and thought about China's connectedness to America and to global flows. And I have a little slideshow about the first time that a powerful American met a powerful Chinese person in China. Was General Grant was going around the world, and he met Li Hongzhang, who at that time was one of the most famous men in the world. They were both among the most famous men in the world. Li Hongzhang had recently been a key general in suppressing the Taiping uprising of the 18. I won't give you the history lesson, but suffice it to say it was about the same time as the American Civil War. And one difference with the American Civil War was a lot more people died. And it was suppressed in 1864, the American Civil War, 1865, almost contemporaneous. So we don't know that they became friends. And one reason was they had actually a lot in common. General Grant, when he went over there after being a president, he had put down a civil war, and Li Hongzhang had put down a civil war. Li Hongzhang was a very savvy guy. He said, isn't it funny that Grant and I have become friends? He's reported as saying this by one of the American journalists. Isn't it interesting that we both become friends when my name is really General Li? OK. moving forward in time, so that was a time when China was very outside of global flows. But during the first part of the 20th century, China became more connected to global flows. It stopped being run by an emperor and officials. Sun Yat-sen became the president of a new China republic founded in 1912. And by now, this is the 1940s. You can see it from other times. This is the Dumbarton Oaks conference. And there's the Chinese delegation and some Western delegations. And the only way you can tell who is by facial features or things. There's nothing separating they're all dressing within this globally accepted code. And it doesn't quite work as definitely with women. There's often more room for national dress among powerful women. But there does become sort of accepted codes. So this was Chiang Kai-shek's wife, Song Mei-ling, with Eleanor Roosevelt. You see they've both got furs. And there's a similarity to the look, if not identical. But then you go forward, and here's Nixon meeting Mao. And they look nothing alike. They're in a totally different kind of thing. And that was partly because Mao was setting himself up as an alternative international order, possibly, to the Western one. Women were dressing very differently. It was largely a unisex period of dressing, not like women in other parts of the world, but more like men in their own country. When Dunc Xiaoping came, even though he was opening things, this is in 1979, he was still dressing radically different than his American counterparts. But this became the most famous moment of his visit to America. And there are lots of reasons. It just showed he was more spontaneous and more ready to connect with another place. But I think the fact it was a sartorial gesture, a local nod to a cowboy hat, that made him seem like possibly a different kind of Chinese leader. But by the time you get to Jiang Zemin and Bill Clinton, they're both being called presidents. They're both meeting dressed basically alike. And I occasionally use a couple of cheap shots. And I just love this image. Does anybody know where this image would come from? It's an interesting connection. I was thinking about it with the Midwest, a region that's trying to define itself in economic terms in certain ways. This is the APEC meetings, the Asian Pacific Economic Group that meets together, and whatever part of the world they meet in, usually, at the end, they pose all together dressed in garb related to that place. So this was them. So here, they're so much apart. They're part of this global system. So they're all dressed in suits that are interchangeable for any part of the world. But they want to flag that they're a particular subset with that. Not that I'm suggesting the Midwestern leaders should all dress in a particular whatever state they're meeting in. But this is a way of saying we're so part of this that we can separate ourselves off in a distinctive way.
Is there anything important about Bush being in blue, or is that?
No, I think that was pretty random, that one. I'm not sure. At least I haven't. I'll look into the color scheme. This was the most recent summit between Obama and Xi Jinping, where people were really thinking this could be a breakthrough, and it didn't seem to actually go anywhere. Particularly, it didn't go badly. It didn't go. The only really memorable thing was it was the Shirtsleeve Summit. They were showing a degree of informality and kind of connectedness of sort of meeting in an informal setting away from some of the pomp. Now that Chinese go on the internet to comment on things, but they often have to do it in roundabout ways, not necessarily doing something that we block, the most famous commentary on this, which is partly just having fun, was to show this image of the two of them, which went viral on the web in China. It speaks for itself. You need to keep things lively. And here's one of the French leader there. OK. And here's just one other thing that I just thought of preparing for this talk about we hired a new person who's specialist in Chinese law at Irvine. And he mentioned something about judges during this recent trial of Bo Xilai. And he said, yeah, have you noticed Chinese judges don't dress in military uniforms anymore? For quite a while they did. But so the Bo Xilai trial wasn't like a trial that we're used to. It was much more stage managed, and there was very limited, the transcript, so-called complete transcript, was just released without people necessarily knowing it was all there, and some of it was cut out. But the forms increasingly look more and more like part of this globalization. So part of the story of China in the recent past has been to figure out which changes are just form and which also have a kind of substance to them. Because clearly some of the things going on have both, but some perhaps not so much. Another thing of the kind of ways in which countries become more and more like each other, when Sun Yat-sen became a president, his face was put on money. Now Mao's face is on money, and people think of that as kind of a holdover from Maoism or something. In fact, it's not. In Mao's day, no leader was on the money. China had broken off not just in the way it dressed, but also in the way it had non-individuals who represented individual classes on the money, and on many of the monuments as well. There was a move away from a certain kind of personality thing, though Mao's personality cult was very strong. So in some ways you can think of this, Mao being on money, as actually putting China in step with a certain way globally of thinking about your money. All right. I can't tell you everything you need to know about China. For that, you need to buy the book. But I'm going to tell you very quickly 5 things that I think is worth everybody knowing that get you beyond certain kinds of commonsensical or things that we sometimes take for granted about China that are wrong. And I'll go through each of them, so it won't be on the test. You don't have to write it down. None of you were anyway. OK. First thing, Brave New World versus 1984. This is a good library kind of theme. Book-related things. 1984 was one of the 2 great dystopian novels of the 20th century. It's still the most widely read of the 20th century dystopian novels. Brave New World used to be much more widely read, but it's still around. And these 2 were seen as representing 2 visions of the horrors, potential horrors of the future. In Brave New World, Aldous Huxley wrote about a world of the future where people were very hedonistic and satisfied their desires, and the government kept control in part through distraction, bread and circuses, very immersive forms of pornography called the feelies that you would watch, soma, a drug you would take that would get you blissed out, and things like that. Whereas George Orwell wrote 1984, which you know is the Big Brother state, where dictators keep control not by manipulating your desires, but by striking fear into you and controlling you. So one's a kind of hard authoritarianism of 1984, or the soft authoritarianism of Brave New World. Brave New World was generally seen as a critique of capitalism and materialism as a danger. 1984 of the totalitarian state as that. It was assumed through the Cold War that 1984 was the one that got Communist Party-run states right, and that Brave New World wasn't really relevant for the communist world. Perhaps if it was a critique we need to worry about in the kind of way in which consumerism and distraction was keeping us. So my argument, very simple, I can go on at length or come back to this in questions, is that to understand China now, you need to understand it as being both some elements of 1984 and some elements of Brave New World. There are places where, so Huxley's soft authoritarianism, culture of distraction, and hedonism explains some things about China. Orwell's hard authoritarianism, culture of fear, understands some aspects of it. And I think you can also think about China now going through 1984 moments, but being in more of a Brave New World period. During a time of a crackdown, the old mechanisms of 1984 come back to the fore. During more ordinary times, it's more of Brave New World. So Orwell said 1984 was the boot on the face over and over and over again. You still sometimes do see the boot on the face as a form of control. In China, you see scenes like these. You also see in 1984, if the government said 2 + 2 = 5, you had to say, yes, 2 + 2 = 5. So if the government says there was no massacre in 1989, you have to say there was no massacre in 1989. There is still some elements of that in China as well. But there's also a lot that's materialism and consumption in China. And so part of the story is much more than it ever was in the Soviet bloc. Part of what keeps the government in control is its playing to consumerism and to desires. And I think you can think of it partly in terms of periods, moments, a crackdown being a 1984 moment, a period of less of loosening being a Brave New World period. But we also have to think of a geography to it. In Tibet and Xinjiang, the methods of control are much more 1984. In places like Shanghai and Beijing, there's much more of an element, at least, of Brave New World most of the time. In Hong Kong, it's much more Brave New World, and it's part of the People's Republic of China, but there's very little to none of the 1984, or no more than in other places. Hence, not completely bizarre that Edward Snowden, when trying to escape the Big Brother state, which he saw America becoming, fled to Hong Kong. It was a little bizarre, but it would have been really bizarre if he'd gone to Lhasa. So this kind of groupthink of 1984 was much more the sort of forced conformity, was an older period, Mao period, whereas now there's much more of the individualism that I was saying. The most individualistic part being Hong Kong, where you can complain about thought control. In an Orwellian state, you cannot complain about thought control. That's a kind of definition of it. So and you can march in Hong Kong. You can do all kinds of things. That's at most a soft form of authoritarianism. But in mainland China itself, what you can say and what you can talk about has changed, even though the Communist Party is still in power, even if it bans a lot of direct criticisms of it. In the quintessential 1984 state, the government even banned, governments always banned 1984 in 1984 states. That was kind of how you could tell. In the Soviet bloc, intellectuals all knew about 1984, but they'd all read it illegally, underground. In China now, in bookstores, well, they ban things very carefully if they're by Chinese dissidents talking about China in certain ways. General celebrations of capitalism are sold, translations of them in the stores. You can buy Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism in a Shanghai bookstore. You can buy George Soros's The Open Society in the bookstores. You can buy 1984 in a Shanghai bookstore, a Beijing bookstore. The Communist Party has moved to be a different kind of Communist Party in not trying to colonize the way people think in the same way as complete control. And giving people consumer goods they like, which for intellectuals can be sometimes challenging kinds of readings. There's even the only 1984 bookstore I know of is in Shanghai and has Orwell things around it. All right, second thing that's important to know about China, which is kind of related, which is, all right, I don't know, some of you probably grew up, I grew up, I'm the kind of, I'm in a generation of China specialists who didn't care about China while Mao was alive. I first started caring about China after Mao was dead. I was born in '61, so I was 15 years old. I vaguely knew about, I knew vaguely about Nixon going to China, but I wasn't really focused on China. I didn't pay much attention to China until college. So one of the only things I associated with China was menus where you didn't have to choose one or the other dish, but you could order a bunch of things. So one from column A, one from column B was the kind of a stock thing that Americans thought about China. What I think is unfortunate is that in American commentary about China, we're sometimes encouraged to choose only from one side of the menu. We're given stark either-or choices. Is China, I think it's important to say China is a competitor and a potential partner, a potential threat and a potential help in differing ways. But often, if you really want to sell China books, usually you are supposed to come down on one side or the other. The Coming Conflict with China, that was a popular book at one time. Or You Don't Have to Fear China, there'll be a variety. When China Rules the World, be one. Or Why China's going to Collapse. When in fact, I think it's important to try, just as you would create mix and match meals at a Chinese restaurant, whereas when I was growing up, in the cafeteria, chicken or fish, or on a plane, chicken or beef, at the Chinese restaurant, you chose some of each. I think when we think about China, it would be good if we got to that as well. So here's an example of what I mean. Xi Jinping. The debate about Xi Jinping is sometimes saying, is he going to be a reformer or not? And Nicholas Kristof, who's won a Pulitzer about China, a big writer on China, said he's predicting the new leader will spearhead a resurgence of reform, economic reform, and probably some political easing as well. So he's going to be a real reformer. This is what Christoph is betting. Some others said, no, he's going to be just like his predecessor. He's not a reformer. But in fact, most of the leaders we've seen in China who we associate with reform had a reform side. They would order off the reform side of the menu when it came to economics, the conservative side of the menu when it came to politics, and we'll likely see that again with Xi Jinping. Another either-or choice we're given sometimes is about an intellectual. We're sometimes made to think there are two kinds of intellectuals or creative figures in China. There are dissidents and there are sellouts. The great symbol of dissident and free thinking right now is Ai Weiwei, who continually is sort of testing the government with his in-your-face kind of dissent. The sellout symbol is Zhang Yimou, a filmmaker who made these independent films and now has become a kind of state choreographer. He's gone from challenging to more and more doing the government's propaganda work. He choreographed the opening ceremony of the Olympics, choreographed a big military parade the next year to celebrate the 60th anniversary of Communist Party. We know how to understand figures in authoritarian states who do one of those two things, who challenge the government, end up in jail or exile or hassled by the police, or sell out to the government and end up being kind of loyal servants. But China has a lot of really interesting people who are neither of those in the intellectual and creative sphere. When Mo Yan won the Nobel Prize for literature, immediately people were saying, oh, is he like Ai Weiwei or is he like Zhang Yimou? If you read his novels, they seem to be kind of criticizing corrupt officials and making fun of parts of society. But he's the vice chairman of the Official Writers Association, so maybe he's more like Zhang Yimou. And they were looking for signs of him either to be an outright dissident or a sellout. In fact, he's somebody who does a little bit of both, but he mostly orders from the conservative side of the menu, loyalist side of the menu. There's another guy, Hu Hua, my favorite current writer. I would have been happier if he'd won the Nobel Prize, who writes some things that he knows can only be published outside of China and are banned. In the Soviet bloc, if you were a banned writer, you stopped being able to publish anything in your own name in your own country. Hu Hua publishes fiction, keeps publishing it in China. He's a member of the Official Writers Association, but then he keeps writing op-eds that can only be published abroad. The government knows they're being published abroad, but that say things he's not allowed to say in China. And he moves between those registers, as do other figures. Like, how many of you have heard of Han Han? A very interesting intellectual figure. And he's China's best-selling, one of China's best-selling authors. He wrote a book that's sometimes compared to Catcher in the Rye of being a sort of novel of young angst that was China's first in this. He's one of the most widely read bloggers in the world. When he puts something up on the web, it gets read by hundreds of thousands of people. It often teases the government and gets scrubbed away, and then other people have posted on their site, so it gets read. But he's also a race car driver and wins races. And he plugs products. He's a product pitchman. And he periodically tacks between doing things that are going to get him in a lot of trouble and getting him in not so much trouble. And then people say, oh, he sold out, and then a new thing cuts out that he talks about. And he often gives his criticism in such a subtle way that it's not even clear you can get it or not. My favorite bit of writing by him, he has he's still very little known, but he has a book that came out of his collection of blog posts that show them. He has a thing saying, I love the Three Gorges Dam, which the government likes, and it's a very controversial thing. He says, and the people who criticize Three Gorges Dam, they're crazy. Because some of them complain about it being an environmental disaster that's going to ruin China's environment. Don't they realize how bad China's environment is already? And he says, and some people say it'd be really an easy target for the Americans. They could bomb it, and it would flood China. No, that's crazy. Don't they know what's downstream from the Three Gorges Dam? The factories that build all the iPhones Americans are addicted to. So, I mean, he's a controversial figure. In some ways, he's like China's answer to Stephen Colbert. Or, all right, there's no single PRC internet story. A lot of the stories you'll hear about the internet in China are about censorship. But there's more to it than that. And a lot of you'll hear about stories about the internet. We'll talk about US internet versus China, or US tech companies. But, well, what's going on that's not about censorship? This is an internet cafe. And And you go into, you hear stories about like what political news is blocked. Most people who go on the internet in China are not going on it to do anything related to politics. Like people who go on the internet everywhere, they're trying to figure out where they're going to go to eat that night, what they're going to buy, what's on sale, and looking for ways to hook up with other people. And a variety of things, or playing computer games in this. And internet cafes are largely for that. So there's a whole nother side to it that is not about just about politics or just about censorship. And there's also a story to it that's not just about us and them. That's not just America or China. You'll hear about Google being blocked in China. The competition between Apple making products and a Chinese firm making products. But there's a whole other part of the world out there that are connected to China in different ways and influencing China. So Facebook is blocked in China. That's a big deal. And YouTube is blocked in China. But there are Chinese counterparts to both of those that keep people entertained through that. So this is QQ, which is one of the competitors to Facebook. And I asked a young Chinese, or not, young American high school student who'd spent a year in China and come back and been very interested in how social media is. I said, I've heard that Facebook and QQ are different. How exactly are they different? She said, well, there are a few differences. People are more likely on QQ to say how much money they make because there's less of a kind of taboo on talking about your salary, in part from a time when everybody had basically the same salary. Okay, I get that. And she said, and of course, you put on your blood type. Again, how many of you know why they put on their blood type? I was going to see if this was a generational thing that would connect. Do you know? You know it? All right, well then hold on for a minute, because I will tell you, to undermine my own expertise, how I got it so wrong. Every story about China is not about politics. I just said that about censorship and things like that. The first thing that I thought of was a political story. China hid the fact that it had an AIDS crisis for a while, and there were tainted blood scandals. So I thought this was a way of knowing who in your friend group that you trusted you could get a transfusion from in a pinch. Totally wrong. The teenager who told me about this just laughed. Blood types in East Asia, it started in Japan, spread to Korea too, and China, is like signs of the zodiac. It's who you might want to hook up with again, or just what your personality type was like. So in Japan, baseball cards put the player's blood type on it. There are guides in Japan to where you'd want to eat out in Tokyo if you were type A positive, and what kind of things you would like. Anyway, this is probably the single most important of the points I wanted to make here about the biggest takeaway. If you only remember one thing, it would be this, I would hope, which is the big China question around 1978 was, can China modernize? It was, and what was interesting was Dunc Xiaoping came to power calling for 4 modernizations. After the chaos of Mao's period, China needed to focus on development in a pragmatic, steady way. The interesting part was that critics of Dunc Xiaoping also thought the most important thing was for China to modernize in a steady, rational way. But they criticized Deng for saying only modernization of agriculture, industry, science, and defense. He said China needed a 5th modernization to move forward, which was democracy and human rights. And Wei Jingsheng, the most important dissident of the democracy of all movement, said, without democracy, economic progress will be impossible. Just keep that in mind. So a pragmatic reason. Americans were hoping that China would modernize also, because Americans thought that if you modernized the economy, if you developed, you would automatically democratize. So the idea was that, that dissidents were saying you've got to democratize first in order to modernize. Americans were saying please do modernize because then you will democratize. And the conundrum now is that China has modernized without having democratized first or without democratizing afterwards. But here, it's time to make sure you're not drifting by giving a free book prize to anybody who can say which famous American said this famous line. When Deng Xiaoping came, he said, "Mr. Vice Premier, it's with great joy that we welcome you to our country. It's with true love that we extend our very best wishes to you and your people on your new long march toward modernization in this century." Shout it out. Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, good answer. It's wrong. Ronald Reagan, another good answer, also wrong. Kissinger, Clinton, Nixon, all good answers, but all wrong. George Bush, that's wrong too. I guess I get to keep my book. But wait, I'll give you a hint. Hey, you didn't need the hint. Who said that? All right, come up afterwards and you get the book. John Denver. Since I always want to give away the book, I don't want to carry a book home with me. I say, would it help you to understand this if I said this will have a special meaning the next place I give my talk, which will be in Colorado, where I'm going in 2 weeks. John Denver played Rocky Mountain High to a very befuddled-looking Dunc Xiaoping and his wife at the Kennedy Center. And this means a lot to me because in China in the 1980s, if you were an American, the first thing, or one of the first things people would say, do you know Country Roads? Can you sing Country Roads? So anyway, we have this time where everybody's thinking China should modernize. We hope China would modernize. We were sort of worried about a China that wouldn't be able to feed its population, that would be weak and chaotic. Now we worry about a China that might be too strong. Now we worry about a China that has modernized in many ways, but not democratized. And these are just all the metrics of ways in which China now, you know, when I was in China in the mid-1980s, the tallest buildings in Shanghai were mostly ones built in the 1920s and 30s. That were about, the highest was 30 stories high or so. And now I go there and think, I remember the time I used to think of Manhattan as having a very high skyline. It's just an insane difference. But now what's happening is the deal the government made of let us keep developing China, we'll keep improving your life, it'll get better and better, but leave us in control. Now, with this as a shot of the smog problems of January, you see China is clearly modern in one sense, but now it's having the problems associated with hypermodernity of this. And people are beginning to wonder, are our lives getting better if we can buy more stuff, but we can't breathe the air necessarily? Finally, I end with the US and China are radically different in many ways, how the press works, how elections work, but we also have a lot in common. And I can talk more about this in question and answer, which I want to get to. But one way to think about it is we have things in common right now. We're both continent-sized countries that see ourselves as being enemies of imperialism and founded by revolutions that were against colonialism. But part of the rest of the world thinks we seem to be willing to stick our noses in other people's business, all sorts of things. But in a lot of ways, what China is most like in America is it's most like what America was 100 years ago or so, while we were the rapidly rising, rapidly industrializing country that seemed perhaps to be doing things on too big a scale, too quickly, with potential things that would shake up the world. When we hosted a World's Fair, we hosted the biggest World's Fair the world had ever seen. When China finally got to host an Olympics and a World's Fair, it did it on scales that the world had never seen. And so where I like to end is with this image, and to think about how Americans need to think about similarities to us, to think about China as now not as a really old country, but in a way being the new kid on the block, a young country in the sense of being part of this club of modern countries of world powers. And to end with this shot, which I've used for a while to talk about the expo coming to China and the excitement to it, but now it's kind of creepy. It's a giant baby that's sort of coming out at you. But I think it sums up well a kind of American worry about how our attitude of China has changed. And I use a quote. I've used a lot of flip references, but I am a university professor, so I should remind you of my academic seriousness. It reminds me of a quote by Homer Simpson, who said, "Children are our future unless we stop them now." And I think Americans have gone from a time as, when is China going to grow up? When is China going to really get with the program and become doing things in this kind of modern way? And now we're wondering how we're going to deal with them being such a big kid on the block. Thanks for your attention.